Good morning and welcome to Sustainable AF, otherwise known as everything you ever wanted to know about sustainability but were too afraid to ask.
This series discusses the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and each episode will explore a particular goal, what it is, why it matters, and how we can address it.
And every week we're going to be looking more closely at the systems that underpin the way we live and try to work out where we can identify actions to take to change the world for the better.
This week, we're going to tackle the first SDG, and that's poverty. The goal is to end poverty in all forms everywhere, especially extreme poverty, where people live on just $1 a day by 2030.
Poverty sounds really simple. It sounds like it's where people don't have enough money to buy food, to get clean water, to have access to healthcare and education. What makes it such a problem is all the things that come alongside it, issues like hunger and illness. It links to other problems like poor sanitation. And if you think about it, you can see these as causes and effects of poverty. That's why it's number one of the SDGs, because if we can solve this, we'll be well on the way to solving a lot of others.
This is what the SDGs are all about. The idea is to change the system so that it works together to create a virtuous circle where the changes we make are for the better, where the system in which underpins the way we live our lives works towards a sustainable, healthier, fairer world.
And one of the reasons we're talking about this now is because it's so obvious how much worse poverty is being made by COVID. Now, for example, the World Bank came out with a report saying they think 150 million people in 2020 would have been pushed into extreme poverty. And that could get worse as the pandemic continues.
Now, there are always going to be political positions taken depending on how people view the world and the solutions that they think are acceptable. So is poverty about a lack of money, not having enough to buy the things that we want and need? In reality, it's about so much more than that. It's complicated and complex, but we can't talk about any type of solutions until we really know what we're talking about.
So let's talk about the different types of poverty. And there are lots and lots of different types, and we need to understand what they are and how they impact people if we're going to successfully achieve change. The most obvious one, and the one we've sort of referred to, is extreme poverty. So that's a scarcity of basic food, clean water, health, shelter, education, and information. That can be, and often is, caused by famine and conflict. But for too many people in the world, it's something from which there's no way out.
The next one is relative poverty. And this is discussed a lot in the social sciences, and it's defined from a social perspective, that is the living standards compared to the economic standards of the population living in your surroundings. This is the big one for social sciences, as I said. Everything is relative, and everyone has someone who is richer and someone who is poorer than them, and we need to analyse this one a little bit to get a good scope on the full poverty scale.
Now, number three is situational poverty. I mentioned earlier with extreme poverty can be caused by conflict, but situational poverty is really different because it's temporary. It is a kind of poverty based on an adverse event, like an environmental disaster or a job loss or severe health problems, so you can't work. It's back to COVID. You know, it's an old saying from the US, but you're 3 weeks away from living in your car. If you've been going through COVID for a year, those people who had savings have probably spent them. This is an issue which can affect anybody at any time.
The next one is rural and urban poverty, which are really different sides of the same coin. In rural areas, there can be fewer job opportunities, less services, less support for disabilities, and quality education opportunities. Whereas in the city, there are more of these things. However, we've all seen tower blocks and the small condensed living situations that some people live in urban areas just because that's where the employment is.
And the big one, this is the one that really makes me grind my teeth, is generational poverty. And this is about how poverty can actually be handed down to individuals and families from one generation to the next.
Generational poverty is more complicated as there's really no escape because people are trapped within it. Children raised in poverty are less likely to go to school, be well fed enough to grow, and in fact are often more susceptible to infections and misimmunizations, which means they will be not as good at reading. They'll suffer from hunger. And often, unfortunately, that then ends up being involved in crime. And we all know that crime doesn't lead to a good life. This isn't because these people are naturally prone to these things. It's because of a lack of opportunity, a lack of support, and basically a lack of alternatives.
And this actually brings us to one of the key problems with poverty. Not only do we often think about the poor as an amorphous mass, but in a lot of the discourse, you'll see there's often a sense that being poor is some kind of moral failing.
Looking at poverty, it has a lot to do with what we as individuals are prepared to do to solve it, as well as how we see it. That old story that commends people for pulling drowning children out of a stream, but also asks who's pushing them in there. Take a look at childcare from neglect. Basically, a child comes from a neglectful family, the state pays for them to go into care or a foster home. Often the results aren't great. Why not flip it on its head, spend that money on supporting the neglectful parents and helping them out? Because I don't believe that anyone comes into this world and becomes a parent wanting to be a bad person, wanting to do bad things. They get pushed into a corner, they have extreme difficulties, and then bad outcomes come, and it's often on the children.
This is actually something very close to my heart because my mother was part of setting up a charity 30 years ago, which was actually just about providing support and help and, mothering teaching to young mothers who were, who had no idea of what they were doing and were often had left care and were living on their own for the first time. We know that poverty is often due to poor education. If people don't have access, especially now during COVID, if you haven't got enough data on your mobile in order to access schooling. We know that it can be driven by mental health problems. We know that it can be driven by drug and alcohol addiction, both of which can come from the previous things. We know that domestic violence can lead to poverty. So does that mean that those who are poor because of these reasons are to blame? Surely it's the luck of the draw in terms of where and how you're born. That brings us again back to this idea of the system. If the system is keeping people in place because it treats people a certain way or expects certain things from them, is that their fault or is it the fault of the system?
Never has a bigger example just come to fruition. If you just look at the police response to the white rioters in Washington in January versus the Black Lives Matter protests, you can just see it in action there. It's ridiculous. You really don't have to be a statistician to see how COVID has been more impactful in communities of colour in the UK and the US for a multitude of factors, often associated with a lack of education, access to healthcare, access to transport, and access to system support, basically.
And I think this brings us back to this fundamental question. Is there some kind of moral value in being born privileged? Are you better? Being lucky enough to be born into a democratic country or a place where you get equal work for equal pay, or that the colour of your skin doesn't automatically change the way that the police treat you, well, that's not something you control.
So now what we're talking about is system failure. And why poverty matters is because it's more than just an injustice. It's about a loss of human potential. It's about inequality and access. If you're part of a system to which you don't have access, either to enough money to pay for the data, to homeschool during a pandemic, or to access government services, or even affordable credit. The people who are just entering the credit ladder who are poor pay the most for their credit card fees because they can't access good credit. That's not right. B, over to you.
Yeah, and I think that's incredibly important because this is an issue about how you have any influence on a system that affects you if you don't have access to that system. You don't. We all know that if you have money, you're more likely to get away with things, but it doesn't mean that that's right. And the trouble is that leads to instability because it leads to people's discomfort about the fairness of the society in which they live. Addressing poverty is fundamental to the stability of every society. Doesn't matter what level, local, national, regional, or global, because it's about an imbalance of power. Poverty is about more than lack of income. It's about not being able to take part in decisions about your own life.
To an extent, poverty is about how we choose to allocate resources. And that's looking at the economic model or the political philosophy. How do we want to allocate resources? In an abstract way or one that considers the importance of the individual matters? Just to be clear, we have more than enough resources on Earth to completely eradicate poverty. It's about the choices we make as people to allocate these resources.
Now, there's no question that poverty has been around forever, but what we actually have today is the opportunity to fix it. It's about changing the systems that allow and encourage it. The thing to remember is no matter how complicated it is, no matter how many factors are involved, that interconnection means that we have lots of different places to try and intervene to make change. The thing that sits behind why we're doing this pod is the fact that every one of the goals we manage to address improves the achievement towards other targets. When we address poverty, we help solve other problems. Every little thing we manage to do makes a difference until we actually manage to flip the system.
A lot of the time, this all does come back to economics. Who is making what? More importantly, why are some people getting so much richer while other people are getting so much poorer? The inequality of who holds the most wealth is frankly astonishing. And there are cultural problems. You're valued by how much you get paid, and that's basically the metric that everyone looks at, where there's so much more to humans. A recent report in the UK said a chief executive earns the same average salary as a normal worker in just 34 hours of work. Do they actually deserve more? And in 2020, let's ask that question. Do they deserve more than doctors, teachers, the scientists that discovered the vaccine, or binmen?
Yeah, no, those are key workers too, because it's about keeping the system going. And the thing is, economics matters not just about how we allocate or value people, but it's also about how we think about responsibility. There's a lot of talk these days about climate change, but that's been driven by the exploitation of natural resources. And the wealth over the centuries has been driven by that exploitation of natural resources and peoples. We need to rethink capitalism. We need to rethink the role of companies. For many years, there was this idea that the more money there was in the system, the more money in companies, there would be trickle-down effects and people would get richer lower down the food chain. But that's been shown to fail. Even Warren Buffett, who is one of the world's largest fund managers, I don't know what size he is, he says trickle-down economics has been shown not to work. I think Milton Friedman's got a lot to answer for. He was an economist who decided, I think in the 70s, and he wrote an article saying that the duty of a director was to maximize profit, maximize return to the shareholder. Well, what about all the things that are costs in that company that aren't included in what that company does? The support for the people who work for them, the support for the people who buy from them. We need to think about what companies are for and whether or not capitalism is fit for purpose. Is it really benefiting us as a society or just the shareholders in the system?
When we look at the idea of material resources that we need to adequately live our lives, we need to engage with shared resources and individual resources. The more people who are supported by collective resources, the less they need individual cash resources. Most of us who are leading adequate but not rich lives, depending heavily on collective resources, not just our own purchasing power. And this is things like infrastructure, like, okay, you don't have a car. Is there the bus available? We are collectively paying for that. That isn't something that we are individually paying for. Your 60p bus fare does not pay for the bus. It's a collective cost. This means that all the non-market stuff we expect local and national governments to provide, which has the effect of widening and enriching the choices we can make, also means things like health service, social care, education, and cultural and recreational services, as well as housing and public transport. Back to the buses. Fee.
And this often becomes seen as a political issue, but at its simplest, it's about worldviews. It's about what people think about the world. It's about what makes them think about what's possible or even an allowable solution. The challenge is it can sound political. The thing about access to resources in a society is this direct trade-off between collective and individual resources. If they aren't provided collectively in some form, then you've got to pay for them, and that might lead to poverty. So there's different systems in different countries operate different systems. The Nordic model to me is fascinating because it's got some of the highest taxes in the world, but people don't necessarily mind paying the high taxes because they have great education, great healthcare, fantastic maternity and paternity leave. All these things, they don't need to find their own individual money to pay for. And it's been quite interesting to look at that economic success through COVID, although obviously we still don't quite know how it's going to work out in infection rate terms. So what do we do instead?
It is hard to talk about poverty and not discuss the fact that more support is needed for the people who are basically most vulnerable. Fee and I both believe in capitalism, but I can't help feeling that it's just getting it a bit wrong. I truly believe it's the best economic system, but some human traits have brought the worst out in capitalism and the way it works today, and that's namely greed. Does anyone really need 200 billion? And I'm doffing my cap here to Mr. Bezos and Mr. Musk. I applaud innovation, entrepreneurship, and driving forward. But as humans, we should work as a collective for the betterment of all. And I guess that's what SDG 1 is all about, helping out people in need because they need it, because it's better for society as a whole. So now let's look at some solutions.
Now, there are loads of solutions to poverty, and one of the most obvious and the one that exists most clearly is philanthropy and charity. And that can range from individuals donating to food banks or to funds to help the homeless in Syria, all the way to billionaires that have pledged to give away half of their wealth. And that does include Elon Musk and Warren Buffett and Bezos and Bill and Melinda Gates.
At a local scale, such donations can make a difference, and charities do incredible work supporting those who have fallen through the social safety net, or those for whom there is no net. But what we need to think about are the things we can do to actually change the system, not just put a plaster on it.
Yeah, because that's the thing. If you are asking for support to be given through the accidental giving of individuals, whoever they are and at whatever scale, isn't that really just putting a plaster on something that needs to be amputated? And it's, what you need to do is think about your own political philosophy. And I don't mean your politics, not whether you're a Tory or you vote Labour or if you're a Republican or a Democrat, but what do you actually believe about the way things work? Do you think people are poor because they don't try hard enough, or that they stay poor on welfare because they don't want to change their lives? Or do you believe that people can become masters of their own fate if they're given the opportunity to do so, and with the right help, raise themselves up out of poverty?
Or do you believe that it's going to be a mixture of the two, that everyone has the right to food, clean water and protection, that a healthy society looks after its vulnerable, and the mighty and wealthy don't just look after themselves? There is some relationship between the us and them.
There does seem today to be a rather unnecessarily binary approach to things. You're either focusing on the importance of individual resilience and growth, or some kind of collective approach, which, opponents can turn around and say it's socialism. But it's this sense of responsibility. There needs to be some kind of common ground where opportunity for growth still exists, but people are not left to rot.
Absolutely. And as Fee just touched on, I'm sure some people are listening to this and being, oh, bloody socialist. We're not. What we're trying to do is use this wonderful framework that is the Sustainable Development Goals to try and carve a better path for 2021 and onwards. So we want to create debate. We don't have the answers. We're just trying to get you guys talking at sort of every level, from the policymakers level to mum and dad school kids. Now, there are obviously technological, political, philanthropic, development and individual approaches that we can take. So let's try and dive into some of these. I think Fee's going to kick off with technology.
Yeah, so we've already really talked about philanthropy. And I think what's important, certainly at the beginning of the 21st century, is this expectation that technology is going to be a silver bullet that's going to solve all our problems. That's not always the case. But what technology can do is transform the way we address a problem. And there are certainly types of technology today which do help address issues around access, whether that's access to digital services or education, whether it's access to credit, which if they can't get, cuts people out of society. And that's things like mobile banking. M-Pesa has done an incredible job, enabling mobile banking, thinking about credit based on mobile use. You don't have to go through getting a bank account, this, that, and the other. E-learning has been transformational and become absolutely critical to society in the last year or so. Mobile healthcare, that's actually changed the way in which access to healthcare is available. You can't not include the idea of clean water technologies. If you can get clean water, you can grow better food. You're not getting sick from what you're drinking. That waste management technologies, not just improving the ones in big cities, but actually extending out to areas that don't have access to infrastructure. Again, transportation can be part of that. But most of all, it's about information. It's about understanding what's possible, where to go for help, and how to access it.
Absolutely. Technology has allowed us in the developing world to leapfrog what we've spent the last 100 years creating in the developed world. And coming back to a billionaire that's leading by example, Melinda Gates, they, as the company Microsoft, are using their money to help pull countries out of poverty through using technology, whether it's focusing on natural resource use or manufacturing to improve the overall economic performance of the country. There are ways to use digital technology in agriculture in the developing world. For example, helping farmers to understand changing weather patterns in order to better their crop yields, using satellites and drones to provide information that helps improve yields and better incomes. Linking technology to the needs of individuals and companies can improve productivity and more wealth, which means ultimately more tax revenues.
And this is where connecting the goals matters, because tax revenues are great, economic productivity is great. The country as a whole is doing better. The question is how you actually ensure that everybody gets to take part in that growth. And this is about equal access. It's about education. It's about gender equality. Women take on the unequal burden of care and unpaid work. Not only does that have an impact on their education and their earnings, that impoverishes society as a whole. I mean, John Stuart Mill 300 years ago was saying you should educate your women because they bring up your sons. I mean, obviously he said it in a more polite way, but you get my point. Direct policies like instituting childcare and indirect ones that shift social norms towards equality. It's things like schooling and public dialogue, things like the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter. It's about challenging the paradigms of power and ensuring you connect things in such a way that everybody benefits from growth. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways in which we can do this. There's some really, really obvious ones, and I'm going to start with my favorite, which is going to piss off Alex because it's his favorite too. But this is this thing about creating jobs. And the reason this is really interesting right now is because of the opportunity for the green economy. Creating jobs has always been the goal of any government because jobs basically allow people to live, to pay for everything that they need. The thing about the green economy and green stimulus is it's this idea that governments spend money to create jobs as quickly as possible to get out of a recession or a problem. And the idea is you create many, many times the return of every dollar or pound spent. What happened last year was that actually central bankers and economists and finance ministers got together and realized that green activities like clean energy infrastructure, low carbon transport, these can create jobs really quickly enough to facilitate economic recovery, but at the same time tackle climate change. It's this unified approach.
Totally right, Fee, and I can't agree with you more on that. And we will talk more around the greening of the economy as we go through the podcast. Next one's a bit more simple, to me anyway. Just raise the bloody minimum wage, just a little bit. Give people that want to work a little bit more onus to get that job rather than living on state aid. Gives them a little bit more money to live and have a bit more fun, I guess. That's as simple as that for me.
Yeah, and I'm going to actually link a whole bunch of things together because they relate to stability and a sense of safety and, safety net, I suppose. But think about it, paid sick and holiday pay. What do you do if you suddenly get cancer and you're the sole breadwinner in your family? What does that mean? You need high quality, accessible childcare so that the adults can go out to work. In the current day, most households need at least two people working, if they can, in order to just keep their heads above water. You need to provide high quality, accessible education and healthcare so that those people who are perhaps in positions of poverty are still able to learn. They're still able to be healthy.
The next one, and this is again another really obvious one to me that I'm very glad is being talked about more, is pay equity between men and women. Women do maybe not exactly the same jobs as us, as in I might be a little bit better than my wife, who's a doctor, at carrying bricks up a ladder. But the jobs that are literally equal, you're both sitting at a desk as a lawyer, give fair pay. It's absolutely ridiculous, and how we've not got that sorted, Or if we don't get that sorted, I'm going to be very angry, basically.
I couldn't agree with you more. Another one that actually I think has a very important role to play is this idea of reforming the criminal justice system. And that's actually got a lot to do with inbuilt biases within the system. If you're wealthy, you're more likely to get off with a tap on the wrist than you are if you're poor. If your skin color is a certain way, you're more likely to be arrested for certain things. No one's saying it's deliberate, but if it's built into the system, if that bias is built into that system, then again, you're talking about blame. It's who's responsible for what. And I think we need to start rethinking how we approach that.
Never has that been made more obvious. We're just going to hark back to the Washington case that we talked about earlier. Look at the two different ways that protesting parties were met by police. That is the biggest show of how unjust the US police system is between black and white. It's literally black and white how bad it is.
One of the things that actually has been discussed as a means of addressing a lot of these problems. Now, something like the criminal justice system, that is a much bigger issue. But the simple things like getting access to education and to be supported, basically all these things about not being afraid that you're going to run out of money, not having to live the stress about deciding whether you eat yourself or give money to your children. Do you buy some medicine? Do you not? There's this idea that's been sort of around for a long time, which is this thing that there should be some kind of basic income. It's called UBI, or universal basic income, and it's actually been touted around as a potential solution to issues around poverty. But I mean, it's more of a concept than anything else at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, for me, it is kind of a no-brainer. And if you look at 2020, where 99% of the workforce was at home but still being paid a percentage by the government, that was basically a form of UBI, except the people who didn't have jobs still didn't get any money, so they're in even more trouble. But just imagine if everyone had a little bit of money a month, a bit like the furlough scheme, to eat, study, and maybe a little contribution to their rent. It would mean that the poor could level up in a massive way, in my opinion.
And this is really actually important, and it actually connects to the next goal, which we'll talk about next week, this idea of mental health. Because Finland ran a 2-year universal basic income study in 2017 and 18. And they gave a whole bunch of people between 25 and 58 payments with no strings attached. And what they found was that people who had received the basic income were more satisfied with their lives and experienced less mental strain than anyone else. Spain has talked about the fact that it's planning on rolling out a UBI for its poorest citizens. And as Alex has pointed out, in the US, direct stimulus checks have actually made a huge difference, even if it's not enough money, but it's made a huge difference to people.
Incredibly as well. Well, this incredible shock to the system, to the economic system, to the global system has, I think, turned a lot of people's heads and made them think a little bit differently. Even the Pope, who is someone who is generally pretty conservative, in his Easter address, suggested that maybe UBI is a good point or a good idea. Now, the biggest complaint people seem to have is, why should some people work and earn money and other people basically do nothing and still be given money? Again, coming back to 2020, that situation has changed minds a little bit, but there's still obviously going to be people that are going to be like, no way. So we'd love to hear what your thoughts are on it after 2020.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting here is, I think the Spanish program, the project is just for the poorest. But the idea of UBI, the idea that everyone gets it, so that, if you're working to have more, you're still getting what someone else has. What you're doing is providing a way that society as a whole is improving. And to be honest, I don't see the problem with that. We're going to come back to this issue again and again in different ways across the SDGs. But basically what we're trying to say is, I don't think we need to live in a world where people are so poor to the extent they can't take part in the same parts of life as everybody else. And when it comes to the SDGs, you've got to love a world that's got something in it that's trying to end poverty.
Absolutely. So we're going to finish it there. So thank you very much, guys. Fee?
Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you will enjoy your journey on your way to becoming sustainable AF.